Welcome to Bloom. Be inspired to be an empowered version of yourself and create meaningful change in the world. Today, my guest is Brett Davidson, whom I met at a mastermind group that is organized by Guillaume Yatter and is a wonderful place to interact, meet, and play games basically with people that are really creative and innovative and bring things to this world that are most unusual. So welcome, Brett. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Julie.
So you were born and raised in South Africa, which I think shapes a lot of your thinking. It shapes a lot of the things you want to transform and achieve. But now you're based in New York, and you were originally trained as a journalist, which also has a lot of importance for your path. You describe yourself as a strategist working with foundations and nonprofits interested in using the power of narrative and creativity for social transformation. So since you do so many things, I think I let you explain what seems to be most important for you.
I think going back to starting as a journalist, I guess journalists are kind of translators of information, right? Gathering information and helping distill it for people. And I suppose that's still holds to be true. So my work is often about helping people think about how to get their word out into the world to make the change they want to make happen. And that a large part of that is actually helping people tell impactful stories. Because stories are really, how people think, how people make sense of the world. And so, how do we tell stories that help people understand the change we need to make and help people figure out how to do that? So a lot of my work is centered in storytelling, but then also what I call narrative change, which is the sort of how do we not only tell stories to communicate to people and to help bring about the change we want, but how do we actually grapple with these underlying longer term narratives, that kind of underlying cultural assumptions that actually often unconsciously impact, how we think about the world and what we think is right and wrong, who we think belongs and who doesn't, and so on, who do we think deserves and who doesn't deserve. And those narratives actually embed particular power imbalances in relationships and hide them so that the world kind of seems natural as it is. Like it just seems natural that certain people should be rich and certain poor and so on, because we have these narratives that are unconscious. And so how do we actually become aware of those and then work to change those underlying deep narratives as well? So that's part of my work as well. So I work with social justice activists and organizations to do that work. But then I do also just kind of, I guess, strategic communications to help people who are experts and where, very well versed in their subjects, think about how to communicate with the rest of us who may not be experts and how to kind of get their message across in simple and effective ways.
So what I hear a lot is the word transformation, and I hear a lot, in a way, challenging the assumptions that we have, which may also be, may have come out of your path of moving from the society that used to be in South Africa, how it transformed, and then going and living in the United States. It's a different world. I think we're right in one of the really important things I would like to talk to you about, and that is I love the name of your company. It's called Wingeed, and there are many beautiful metaphors attached to that, and you describe some of them on your homepage. So you talk about connection, fertility, and creativity, and about spreading and seeding ideas, helping them grow and bear fruit. And I think I've very rarely seen a more beautiful name for a company.
Oh, thank you.
And it is so HSP. I mean, you've got almost everything in there that is really important to most highly sensitive people. And I remember when I first met you, you had not even heard that that group of people actually existed.
Mm.
And if you want to, we could very briefly talk about this, what I understood, a feeling of relief that there were other people out there that had similar kinds of, what's the English word for that? Interests, ways of being in the world, ways of feeling and connecting and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think actually that happened when I talked to you, but I think also there's a book that I read called Quiet, which is
Mm,
about sort of introverts, and that was kind of a relation as well. I think um, often people talk about me as the quiet one, or saying sometimes, doesn't say much, often in social situations. Um, and I think in a world that's really extroverted, you know, one can grow up feeling a bit like something wrong with you, or that, why aren't you as extroverted or as loud as other people? Um, and of course, but then realizing actually, there's a place for quieter people, there's a place for people, and it's not something wrong with you, it's just kind of how you're built, it's how you take in the world, how and so on. But then also that is valuable. And then that book Quiet talked about the value of introverted leaders, for example.
yes,
Um,
I love that book. Mm,
so, just thinking about that. But, I think also, and I think, in recent years, there's been a lot more, I guess, awareness of just people and how people are just constituted differently. Our brains work differently, our senses work differently, and so on, in many different ways. And then appreciation of that rather than saying everyone should fit kind of one mold. And I think that is a relief, because you kind of then say, okay, well, this is who I am, and what is valuable about that, and what do then I bring to the world that maybe other people don't. And of course, I can be as loud and extroverted as well. Sometimes it's not like I'm a quiet person all the time, but it's just thinking about, I actually love that definition of introverts as people who kind of expend energy when you're with others, right? And introverts are people who gain energy as you're with others. And so, you need to every now and then actually retreat and re sort of restore and build up your batteries again. But it's also kind of, giving, I guess, sitting back a bit and listening to what other people are doing, what other people are saying before then deciding what to say. So it's kind of like taking in the world, processing it, and then kind of figuring out how to act. And I think the impetus in the world is often, you know, just act rather than take time to think about it.
mm, yes, and I think one of the strengths that we have is actually to take time to think, to think through the complexities of things, to ruminate on something until we've sort of come up with the innovation or with a click, basically, that gives us that other way of looking at something. And I will come back to this very soon because we wanted to talk about listening, which I think is
Mm,
really, really important in your context. But what I wanted to say is um, how much there is this power of the quiet person, of the introvert, that is very often forgotten. And for example, in your case, if people go and look up the things you've gone into situations that are immensely challenging, even though you're an introvert. The things the projects you've had, the people you've talked to, it's not like you wrapped yourself in silk. I mean, you really went out there, into situations that many people that are extrovert would never think of going. So there is a very quiet, centered power in what you do and who you are. And that I would like to use to segue to two central topics in your approach. And the first one is what I call the art of listening,
mhm.
which is something that highly sensitive people and especially introverts are really good at. So could you expand a little bit on that, on the importance that actually has for your work and for your worldview and for the transformation that you want to seed and spread?
Yeah, well, I think listening kind of comes up again and again in my life, in my career, and if you think about journalists, and I wasn't just a journalist, I worked in radio. It's all about listening. I mean, in fact, I grew up in South Africa when we didn't have TV. Radio was all we had. So my way of learning about the world was through listening. Um, and then working as a radio journalist, I think to be a better interviewer and get the kind of information and get the real captivating story, you have to practice listening, practice understanding, trying to closely listening to what people are saying, but also thinking about what will get other people to listen, right? What will get people to tune in and stay tuned in. So I
Mm,
think it comes from there. But then also, in South Africa, we also were going through a transformation from, racist authoritarian government to a democratic one. And as part of that process, we had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which had many shortcomings, but the fundamental idea was that people should listen to the truth of what had happened so that we could
Mm.
deal with it. And of course, many people did not want to listen and tuned out. But the fact is that was a kind of process as part of the transition. So I think it comes through again and again, this idea of listening. And then when we worked with storytelling, when I moved to the US, and we kind of had storytelling workshops for various groups of people, the folks we worked with emphasized listening as just as much as telling. So, you have to create the environment for deep listening before you'll actually get people to tell deeply personal and true stories. And so, those are kind of two sides of the same coin. But again, as I talked about action and kind of our society's bias towards action, I think there's a real bias towards speaking and rewarding people who speak, even if
Mm.
then what they say is kind of not really that meaningful.
Yeah.
And certainly in the US, that is definitely true. Um, if you
Mm.
think about colleges and schools, people are actually given better marks for, speaking out. And if you don't speak, you're kind of graded down. In the workplace as well, the people who speak and who are the loudest and who speak the most are often given, the promotions and so on, and paid attention to, and so on and so on. And yet we don't incentivize and we don't value the people who sit back and listen. Um, and yet that is as important, if not more. And so thinking about listening, not just in a personal sense of like, how can I be a better listener, but actually, how can we create the systems and the structures that enable and incentivize listening? Um, I think throughout my work that, trying to also think about that, and move away from the individual and putting the burden always on the individual to do the right thing or to make yourself healthy or to do the listening. Yes, that's important, but are our social structures and systems also encouraging that and enabling that? So I think, how do we connect that individual to the systemic? I think that's also really important.
Yeah, so you say, I think it's on your homepage, you say listening is crucial for transformation. So in that sense, having been trained as an anthropologist, that really reminds me of other societies that make that the center of their communication, the way they decide things, the way they decide to move into one direction or the other, or how to deal with a challenge. They actually sit down and first they don't say anything for a while. Everybody hangs around with their own thoughts. And then somebody will start to talk, and then that is discussed. People listen. And, it can take a really long time. In our society, I think we would not even be able to sit through it because we get so antsy.
Yeah.
Even us who have a tendency for that kind of thing get really antsy because it's like, I want to say something, I want to be heard. Um, but it tells us that it exists in human societies. It is possible. So you also say if we want to create a more just and sustainable world, we need to focus on transforming systems more than individual behavior. And you touched on that a little bit. Could you go a little bit deeper in that, and maybe let's just briefly go back to the importance of listening in that context?
Yeah, so if you think about almost anything, right? And I worked a lot in health, so I used to think about it in health. Often our health systems are based on this idea of individual responsibility and reward and blame. So, if you're unhealthy, it's like, did you eat the right things? Did you smoke? Did you drink? And so on, right? Which is obviously all important. Um, but we don't think about, well, do you have access to healthy food? What are the is it actually easier for you to eat healthily or not? Can you afford healthy food? Um, does your social system reward you for, eating healthily? But then even beyond that, there are things that are totally out of control. Like maybe you live in an area that is heavily polluted, and because of something like structural racism, that kind of often is the neighborhoods of people of color, Black people, and so on. So that
Mm.
impacts your health. The impact of discrimination and racism and so on, we've seen that actually impacts people's health. Living in a society that discriminates against you, whether it's trans people, LGBTQ people, Black people, and so on, that
Mm.
actually takes a toll on your health. So it actually has nothing to do with individually what you decide to do or not to do. There's a whole lot of factors. We call them the social, the social determinants of health or the structural determinants of health.
Mm.
but but then that comes into almost everything, if you think about, transport or so on and so forth, like some people live in a society where, in particular in America, aside from a place like New York, where it's super difficult to get around by walking, you have to have a car. So that also has all sorts of other implications. So, we have to link the individual to the systemic and think about how do we actually change systems and structures to then enable people to thrive, enable people to flourish. And then, of course, I'm not saying individual behavior and so on is not important, but you have to see it in this much larger context.
Yes, I would agree with that. So I really like your point that human beings thrive in community. And if we feel that we're not part of community because of our, let's say, gender, I mean, the same goes for women sometimes, or for somebody, who has some other kind of diversity or just happens to have the wrong color of the skin, that really, really impacts our health. I think, mental and physical health, because we are so community orientated animals, I would say.
Yeah.
And I really like your take that, and that again is typical HSP in the sense that we look at the system. There's importance to understand that individual behavior only goes so far. So let's say you have a context of discrimination, there will always be some people that will say, well, why should I discriminate that person? I honestly, why should I? But if the community as a whole does, you have a problem. Yeah. And
Yeah, and it's not even like it's and then if the laws or the whatever it is are set up in a way that it's not just even if a collection of individuals decide to do something differently, but if you know there's all sorts of other things that are set up around that you have to change as well. So
yeah, you
it's
have,
beyond an individual, it's beyond an individual prejudice or kind of it's much bigger than that. It's embedded into our laws and in the way society is structured and so on. So we have to change that.
yeah, and to understand, to have that understanding, and to actually look for the tools and the people in the community to build that kind of transformation. No one can do it on their own. And I think
Yeah.
that is a huge challenge for many people that want to, what's the English word, elicit or organize or bring, systems transformation to this world, that they need to be able to find community. They need to be able to find other like-minded people that are interested in the same part of the system's change in order to actually move something. And
Yeah.
that is, for many highly sensitive people, that's one of the biggest challenges, because we are so trained and we have experienced so much isolation and that we don't fit and that we're different. But
Yeah.
you are one of the cases where that actually worked. Where you managed, and you still managed to build that community for other people and to network and contribute to the transformation where you want to see it. So for everybody that listens, guys and gals, it's possible. It is possible. And I would like now to talk about the second central topic, which I'm fascinated about, and that is your take on embodiment. And there are three times you actually use or express the importance of embodiment for human life. And that is one, you say human thinking is embodied thinking. And then I remember I think it was in one of the mastermind sessions, you used the expression embodied listening. And then when I was reading through your things, I was thinking, yeah, Brett is actually talking about embodied transformation. So can you expand a little bit on that? Why you have that take? Why the body is so important for our lives?
Yeah, I think I guess I spent a lot of time, and it's been a long process of getting out of my head. I lived in my head, I guess, as someone who again was um fairly isolated and lonely as a young person. I lived a lot in my head, right? And trying to get, and I still do, but trying to think about being more embodied and live in the world as an embodied person. Um, but then also I think about what am I going with this now? I think
Well,
there's almost a tradition of kind of this idea of the mind separate from the body, kind of, right? So now we
mm,
kind of also think about we're a mind in a body. We kind of this thing that sits behind our eyes that is separate from the body. And we can, and especially I think I've been thinking about it in the context of the development of AI,
mm,
because this, you get all this popular culture and the kind of idea that, oh, eventually we'll all be uploaded into some kind of cloud, right? We'll kind of upload ourselves and we'll shed our mortal bodies and we'll exist in this kind of AI universe. But that's a really false idea of this thing that we are separated from our bodies, and there's a kind of us which is just living in our bodies temporarily, and we can suddenly somehow remove ourselves from our bodies and exist somewhere else. But I think that's just fundamentally wrong. I think we are our bodies, we are our mind and our bodies together. They're not two separate things.
mm,
And if you would one day be able to upload a brain into something else, that would not be the same you as the embodied you that exists and lives in the world. Um, and then, I think working on this idea of narrative and messaging and storytelling, metaphors are really important, right? And the kind of things we use to describe other things. And you and I were talking about this over the last couple of days, but there's, George Lakoff and I think Mark Johnson have written about this and how our abstract thinking actually arises from our physical embodiment in the world. So there are a lot of metaphors and concepts related to the idea of up and down, for example, or forward and back. We associate good with up and bad with down. We associate north with up and south with down. We associate, we think about time as moving forward and going to the past as moving backwards. Some other cultures think of the other way, right?
mm.
That you move backward into the future and forward into the past because you can see the past, you can't see the future. Um, but but the thing remains that actually many, in fact, if not all of our abstract concepts originally arise from embodiment in the world and this physical sensation of moving in the world. Um, and so I think it's really unhelpful and quite destructive to think that we're just these abstract minds living in a body, living in a body that has no relevance as to who we are. And I think we learned that from feminist thinking. I think we learned that from anti-racist thinking as well. Like people are moving in bodies that are discriminated against, that are seen differently, and so on and so forth. You
Mm.
can't just remove that. Um, so I think it's really crucial that we get to grips with that. And I think then, this idea that goes along with it, the likes of Elon Musk, that somehow we're just going to leave the Earth and go and colonize Mars. Um, I think it leads to all sorts of other things. Like we can then don't worry about destroying the environment. It doesn't matter. We can go somewhere else, whether it's Mars or the cloud. Um, and I think that's really destructive. I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we're living in bodies in this world right now on this Earth. And then what does that mean? That also means we're then not separate from everything else. We're connected to the environment. We're not separate from other beings, from the non-human. Um, we're part of this earth, inextricable part of this earth. And then that brings a whole ecological set of thinking into it as well. So I think it's really, really important to think about embodiment in that way.
Yeah, yeah. And like we talked about that a little bit before. I've deeply studied embodiment because it was very important in the context of my own work. And, I find it so absurd to 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 think that we can upload who we are into a cloud. And forgetting again something that other communities know really well, and that is that the connection we have through our energy field and our body is our cloud. That is the cloud we actually live in. It's just that Western societies, rather than indigenous societies, we've forgotten that. We really think that our mind has primacy, and it doesn't. As a psychologist and as somebody who studied, biology and anthropology and all kinds of things in neuroscience, I can tell you that is not the case. It is our bodies, our feeling bodies, especially for sensitives, that always has primacy. And we have this weird idea. There's somebody called David Grant. He wrote a book that's called Brain Spotting, which is a brain-based method to work on trauma. He says, I don't believe in a mind-body connection because I do not believe in a mind-body separation. And I think that's what we're talking about here. And the consequences of our thinking that we are just mind and that retreat out of our emotions is hugely problematic for very sensitive people, because we live even more in our emotions and even more in our bodies. And if we try to fit into a society that keeps telling us that our intuition, our feelings, our body, our sensuality, our connection to each other and the world is not worth anything, we have nowhere to go.
Mm.
And that's why I love your work.
Yeah, I think again, like I grew up in a very Christian household. Many of my ancestors were ministers or missionaries. My father was a minister. My uncle was a minister, and a lot in Christianity, you're taught that your body is bad and evil, right? And the sensations, the pleasures, whatever, just you should kind of think of them as bad and sinful, and kind of become a spirit, and then eventually you'll die, and your spirit will be separated from your body and live in heaven, right? So that's kind of
Finally,
deeply in.
finally.
Yeah, which is this one fundamentally, I think, really destructive to a lot of, things. And then you look over history and the history of colonization and so on, and you realize that along with that goes a devaluing of the body, which is then associated with the feminine, right, with
Mm,
emotions, which are also seen as inferior. It's associated with blackness versus whiteness. A lot of writing and metaphors around like white is pure, disembodied, and so on. And black is embodied and impure. So you get a lot of these kind of things that come up in Western thinking that are really arise from this kind of ridiculousness of the idea that your kind of mind is separate from your body, and then the devaluing of the body. And I sort of started thinking about this a lot because in the work, the human rights work and social justice work, I think, we love the facts, and we always thought that if you just tell people the facts, the information, right, the intellectual stuff, they'll realize the facts and then they'll change. And of course, we realized that that doesn't happen. The facts are not enough. But and this idea that you shouldn't try and sway people using emotion, that somehow emotional thinking is inferior thinking. Well,
or
it's not, and it
dangerous,
turns
or
out,
dangerous,
or dangerous.
Yeah.
But it turns out from like neuroscientific research that you actually cannot think without emotions. Like emotions are fundamental to your thinking. And there's a lot of research showing that, for example, any decision, you cannot make a decision without emotions. And they've learned that from people whose brains have been damaged, and they can list pros and cons, but they cannot decide because there's not that emotional impetus that gets them to decide one or the other. And so it's really false to and think that, purely rational, logical thinking is superior. It's not. It's actually not even proper thinking. And so yeah, and so I think that this is just and this that, but like the work that the world I lived in and worked in is kind of operates on that process, and then we wonder why people are not changing.
Mm.
Now, of course, we're seeing in this world now we're seeing, I guess, the rise of the opposite, which is the kind of um, I guess, idea that there is no truth, there is no objective facts, that we can just make stuff up, which is also as destructive and as problematic. Um,
Yes. And
but
that we
I think
can
we have
weigh and, excuse me.
No, but I think we have to grapple with that and say, actually, it's not that the truth doesn't matter. It's not that facts don't matter. It's not that logic doesn't matter. But we have to integrate that with emotion. We have to, again, it's all connected. We cannot think of these things as separate.
No, our biology can't think of it separate. We talked about that briefly before, that we cannot, if we take emotions and movement out of the equation, because like we said, neurologically movement is at the base of most of our language and how we experience the world. And if we subtract them out of human experience, there's not much left. I mean, if you're going to brain science, the people that have damaged the right hemisphere, they're dead boring. They're like machines. There's nothing that can connect. So is that the world we want to create?
Exactly. Yeah.
A world that can just be measured and weighed and is totally rational. It's a dead world. It's a dead world.
Yeah, exactly.
I would very briefly like to just mention your storytelling and your relationship to stories in this context.
Well, I think again that comes from my sort of history, working in radio, and I realized that the people that I interviewed who really were gripping and that you'd want to listen to are the ones that knew how to tell a good story. It would make it come alive. And then when I moved to the US and started working in sort of public health and working with activists, I realized that if we could help them learn how to tell a story, because I think, not everyone naturally can tell a good story. Everyone has a story, but not everyone knows how to tell it effectively. And so how can we help people identify and tell their stories in an effective way? again, to connect, right? Because it's all about connecting people to people. We have to get away from this idea that, oh, we're talking just about abstract ideas. In the context of health, where certain people are just determined to be criminal or undesirable, whether it's people who use drugs, LGBTQ people, and so on and so forth, sex workers. How do we do away with that discrimination and that stigma and that kind of stigmatization? Well, you do that by creating human connection, and the way you create human connection is by telling one another stories and sharing the truth of who you are through a story. And we know again from a lot of research that that's how we do connect. And getting back to embodiment, we have this concept of mirror neurons. So if I use in my storytelling language of senses, like I talk about a red ball, or I talk about the skin prickling on my arms, you can feel that, you can see that. Your neurons around those senses are ignited. And so that's what enables you to experience my experience and enables you to connect with me. And so that's why I think storytelling is so important and powerful, and we have to think about how we engage people through stories.
And by listening through stories, we also connect that patience and interest that is expressed through listening, because you cannot hear properly if you are always concerned with what you want to say next. So stories are wonderful. And if they're good stories, they're really wonderful in training people to listen deeply with their hearts, Absolutely. With their bodies and their minds, obviously.
Yeah.
I love
and again, thinking about that, you cannot listen properly if you're uncomfortable, if you're too cold, you're too hot, you're in pain. That interferes with the listening as well. So how do you, again, think about those things when you're trying to create a good listening environment?
Yeah, like people used to gather around the fireplace, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, also sitting in a circle, maybe. Yeah, things like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Brett, I know we could talk for a very long time, but I think we're coming to the end of this session, and there's always one question I ask at the end, and that is there something I did not ask you that you think might be still important in this context for our listeners to know or to think about?
I don't think so. No, I don't think anything's outstanding.
So maybe you could just say one sentence about the stories we tell ourselves. Because you have this sentence, a strategy is a story we tell ourselves about who we are, what our aim or purpose is, why it is important, and how we think we can achieve it. So I really love that, because we come up with strategies to resolve things all the time. And I just love that you say a strategy equals a story. And it is a story we created from what we think who we are and what the world is. And how, from what I understood talking to you, how that can actually be changed by exchanging stories.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this in the context of, organizational strategies in the world right now where things are changing so quickly. How do we create strategies when by the time we've spent months developing a strategy, the world has changed and the strategy is irrelevant? And I think if you then understand yourself as being in a story and have an idea of who you are as a character in that story and what your goal is, and what values motivate you, I think that can help you guide you through rapid changes, right? And you can say, okay, now this thing has happened, which I didn't anticipate, but as this is who I am, these are my values, that's my ultimate goal. So then how does that guide my next step? And I think that can be super helpful, especially when we're now bombarded with, rapid changes and things that we didn't expect just coming every day. But it's just, a story of who I am. We each have a story of who I am. What am I doing in the world? What is my goal? And that's a story, right? It's a projection of any kind of story is like that, right? You have someone in a situation but wants to get somewhere else, and they confront obstacles along the way, and have to figure out how to get there. And we're each living those stories in our lives. That they're not. There's not just one story for each of us. There are many but what is that story for ourselves, and then how does that guide our steps along the way as the kind of we are confronted by very confusing and very challenging developments in the world.
So it would be very important to have a story that is really fitting for ourselves and authentic and empowered, rather than to have a story of being a victim. And I think the other thing that you mentioned is I lost it now, is that we can rewrite our stories. If you think about it, that it's an interpretation also of what happened to us. We don't have to stay stuck. I mean, there might be some things that based on our trajectory, have an influence. But if it is a story, then we can maybe not change it completely, but we can open a new chapter, or we can add something, or we can, throw something out. And to understand, I think to understand that helps in this chaotic world, that we are not like our ancestors many times. You start with something and then you go through your life and it's basically already all decided, and then you go into retirement and then you drop dead, but in between there is not a lot of development. And I think that's the potential of the world we live in now, that at any age we can start rewriting our story and reinterpreting our story. We're not fixed the way it was before.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think the other thing is how are you thinking about other people in your story? Like, who are the other people and how are you positioning them? And are you positioning them in a way that enables them to be active and have agency as well? Or are you positioning them as kind of just passive observers? So as well, how do you think about other people as characters in that story?
Yeah. Wonderful. Brett, I really, really appreciate this conversation. And thank you very, very much for having followed my invite. And
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate it.